I was 26 when I learned that love in my family had always come with conditions. I thought the eviction notice taped to my bedroom door was the worst betrayal I'd ever face, until fate turned cruelly poetic and my parents came back, not with apologies, but with medical files and trembling hands. My name is Amelia, and this is the story of how the people who tried to erase me from their lives later asked me to save theirs with my body. Amelia learned early that her presence in the Hale household felt like a question no one wanted to answer. She was not loud enough to be admired, not quiet enough to be ignored properly, and never quite shaped to the image her parents carried like a silent blueprint in their minds. Her father, Richard Hale, believed children were reflections of their parents' discipline. Success to him meant control over money, reputation, and especially over his family. Amelia's mother, Margaret, wrapped that control in the language of sacrifice, reminding everyone how much she had given up and how gratitude should look. Between them, love was transactional, and Amelia could never figure out the currency. From the outside, their home appeared stable, even enviable. A neat lawn, polished furniture, family dinners that followed strict routines. Inside, Amelia felt like furniture herself, present, useful at times, but never truly seen. Her older sister Clara understood the rules instinctively. Clara smiled when expected, agreed when necessary, and learned early that survival in their family meant compliance. Amelia, on the other hand, asked questions. Why did approval come with conditions? Why did mistakes linger longer on her than on anyone else? Why did she feel lonelier in her own home than anywhere else in the world? Richard often said Amelia was difficult, a word that followed her like a shadow. Difficult for wanting to study something practical but not prestigious enough. Difficult for working part-time instead of relying fully on the family. Difficult for expressing opinions at the dinner table when silence would have been easier. Margaret would sigh and tell her she worried too much, that Amelia didn't understand how families worked, that one day she'd regret pushing so hard against the people who loved her. Yet that love always felt fragile, as if it could be withdrawn at the slightest inconvenience. The moments that hurt the most were never the arguments, but the quiet comparisons. Clara's achievements were celebrated openly, her promotions, her engagements, her ability to keep the peace. Amelia's efforts were acknowledged with caution, as if praising her too much might encourage rebellion. When Amelia stayed up late studying or came home exhausted from work, no one asked how she was holding up. Instead, Richard would comment on how independence made people selfish, while Margaret warned that a woman who stood alone too confidently would eventually find herself unwanted. By her early 20s, Amelia felt like a guest in her own life. Her bedroom was the only place where she could breathe freely, a small space filled with books, scribbled notes, and quiet dreams she never spoke aloud. She imagined a future where she wasn't constantly measuring herself against expectations that kept shifting just out of reach. Still, part of her clung to hope, the naive belief that if she tried harder, explained herself better, softened her edges just enough, her parents might finally see her not as a problem, but as their daughter. That hope began to fracture the night Richard accused her of being ungrateful for questioning a financial decision he made on her behalf. The argument wasn't explosive. It was colder than that, controlled, calculated. Margaret stood beside him, not angry, just disappointed, which somehow cut deeper. Clara watched from the doorway, silent, already understanding how this would end. Amelia realized then that fitting in had never been the goal they wanted for her. They wanted obedience, not belonging. As Amelia lay awake that night, staring at the familiar cracks in her ceiling, she felt something settle inside her. Not peace, but clarity. She had spent her entire life trying to earn a place that was never freely offered. The realization didn't make the loneliness disappear, but it named it. And once named, it could no longer be ignored. The conversation that led to Amelia's eviction did not begin as a storm, but as a quiet, suffocating drizzle that had been falling for years. It started one evening at the dinner table when her father, Richard, casually mentioned that the household expenses had increased and that everyone needed to pull their weight. His tone was measured, almost reasonable, which made Amelia hesitate before responding. She pointed out that she already paid for most of her own needs, contributed monthly when she could, and worked long hours to avoid being a burden. The words were barely out of her mouth when she felt the familiar shift in the room, the subtle tightening that signaled she had crossed an invisible line. Questioning in their home was the same as defiance. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as though he were preparing for a negotiation he had already won. He spoke about respect, about how living under his roof came with expectations, and how independence should not be confused with entitlement. Margaret joined in softly, reminding Amelia of everything the family had provided over the years, her voice layered with practiced concern. She spoke of gratitude, of loyalty, of how painful it was for a mother to feel unappreciated by her own child. Amelia tried to explain that she wasn't ungrateful, that she only wanted transparency and fairness, but her words seemed to dissolve before reaching them, as if the air itself refused to carry her side of the story. The argument never escalated into shouting, which somehow made it worse. There were no slammed doors or raised voices, only calm sentences that carried finality. Richard said that if Amelia was so eager to live life on her own terms, perhaps it was time she truly did so. Margaret looked down at her plate and added that maybe some distance would help Amelia learn perspective. Clara sat silently, eyes fixed on her glass of water, her silence louder than any accusation. Amelia realized then that the discussion had never been about money or behavior. It was about control, and the decision had already been made long before she spoke up. Later that night, Amelia returned to her room with a heaviness she couldn't shake. She told herself that things would cool down by morning, that this was just another tense family moment that would be buried under routine and forced politeness. But when she opened her door, she saw the envelope resting on her desk. Inside was a typed notice, brief and formal, stating that she had 30 days to vacate the room. It cited ongoing conflict and the need for household harmony. The words felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life, not hers. She read the letter again and again, waiting for the meaning to soften, but it only grew sharper with every glance. When she confronted her parents, there were no apologies, only explanations. Richard said it was for the best, that adulthood required difficult lessons. Margaret insisted this wasn't abandonment, just a push toward growth. They spoke as though they were doing her a favor, reframing rejection as wisdom. Amelia stood there listening, nodding, feeling something fundamental crack inside her. The house she had grown up in, the place she thought of as home, suddenly felt foreign, as though she were already a visitor being politely asked to leave. Packing her belongings was the most painful part, not because of what she took, but because of what she left behind. Every item she placed into a box carried a memory: school notebooks, old photographs, small keepsakes she had once believed proved she belonged. Clara hovered nearby, offering half-hearted help, whispering that maybe this would all blow over if Amelia just apologized properly. But Amelia knew better now. Apologies were only useful if they restored peace, not dignity. She carried her suitcases to the door on the final day without looking back, afraid that if she did, she might beg to stay somewhere she was never truly wanted. As she stepped outside, the door closed behind her with a soft, ordinary click that felt louder than any slam, and in that moment, Amelia understood that the illusion she had clung to for years, that love in her family was unconditional, that patience would eventually be rewarded, had been quietly dismantled, leaving her alone on the threshold of a life she never planned, but now had no choice but to enter. The first weeks after Amelia left her parents' house blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. She stayed on a friend's couch at first, her suitcases lined up against a wall like temporary markers of a life in transit. Every night, she replayed the moment the door closed behind her, wondering how something so final could have sounded so ordinary. She told herself this was only a pause, that her parents would eventually call, that distance might soften whatever rigidity had hardened between them. But days turned into weeks and the silence stretched, forcing her to confront a truth she had long avoided. If she wanted stability, she would have to create it without them. Amelia threw herself into work, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. She took extra shifts, accepted responsibilities she wasn't sure she was ready for, and learned how quickly survival sharpened her focus. Money, once a background concern, became a constant calculation. Rent, food, transportation, savings, emergencies she couldn't afford to have. She found a small studio apartment with thin walls and a stubborn radiator that rattled through the night, but it was hers. The first evening she slept there, on a mattress laid directly on the floor, she cried quietly, overwhelmed by the strange mix of grief and relief that came with finally having a space that did not require permission. Independence was not the freedom she had imagined in her younger years. It was heavy and unglamorous, filled with long days and longer nights where no one checked in unless she reached out first. Yet, within that weight, Amelia discovered something steady growing. She learned how capable she was when there was no one to undermine her decisions or question her worth. She made mistakes, missed payments, trusted the wrong people, pushed herself too hard, but each misstep belonged solely to her. There was no one to blame, but there was also no one to diminish her efforts, and that alone felt like progress. It was during this fragile rebuilding that Amelia met Ethan. He entered her life quietly, without drama or urgency, a coworker who noticed when she skipped meals and remembered small details she mentioned in passing. Ethan was not grand in his gestures. He was consistent. He listened without trying to fix her, offered help without making her feel indebted, and never asked her to be smaller to make him comfortable. When she told him about her family in fragments, carefully edited to avoid sounding bitter, he didn't flinch or question her perspective. He simply believed her, and that belief felt like a kind of safety she had never known. As their relationship deepened, Amelia began to experience a different model of connection. Arguments did not end in threats or withdrawal. Disagreements were conversations, not ultimatums. Ethan's presence did not erase the pain of her past, but it softened its edges, reminding her that love could exist without conditions attached. Slowly, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by what she was building. She celebrated small victories, paying bills on time, receiving praise at work, waking up without dread, and learned to acknowledge her own resilience without waiting for anyone else's approval. Still, the absence of her family lingered like a low ache. Holidays were the hardest, marked by empty spaces where traditions used to be. Clara sent occasional messages, careful and vague, as if walking a tightrope between loyalty and concern. Their parents remained distant, their silence a confirmation that Amelia's departure had been less a tragedy and more an inconvenience. With time, Amelia stopped checking her phone so often, stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen, and began to accept that closure might not come in the form of reconciliation. What surprised her most was not how much she missed them, but how much she changed without them. She grew more decisive, more grounded, less willing to tolerate emotional manipulation disguised as care. She started to trust her instincts, to value her own voice, to recognize that survival did not require her to return to the place where she had been diminished. The life she was building was imperfect and often lonely, but it was honest, shaped by her choices rather than their expectations. And for the first time, Amelia understood that walking away had not been an act of failure, but the beginning of learning how to stand on her own terms. The call came on an afternoon that was otherwise unremarkable, a quiet pause in the middle of Amelia's workday when the world felt momentarily still. She almost ignored the unfamiliar number, assuming it was another telemarketer or a wrong call, but something in her hesitated, a subtle pull she couldn't explain. When she answered, the voice on the other end was professional and carefully neutral, introducing itself as a coordinator from a regional hospital. Amelia listened politely, half distracted until her father's name was spoken, clear and unmistakable, slicing through her calm with sudden force. The coordinator explained the situation in measured terms, describing organ failure, test results, and timelines with a detached efficiency that left no room for emotion. Richard's kidneys were failing rapidly, she said, and Margaret's liver condition had worsened beyond what medication could manage. Transplants were no longer a distant possibility, but an urgent necessity. Amelia felt her chest tighten as the words settled, each one heavier than the last. She had not heard her parents' name spoken aloud in years, not in a way that carried urgency or vulnerability, and the shock of it left her momentarily speechless. There was a pause, then the coordinator asked if Amelia would be willing to undergo compatibility testing. The question was framed gently as an option, but the implication was clear. Family members were often the best matches. Amelia murmured that she needed time to process, and the call ended with assurances that the hospital would follow up. When she set her phone down, her hands were trembling, and she realized she had been holding her breath. The room felt smaller, as if the past she had worked so hard to outgrow had suddenly pushed its way back into her carefully built present. That evening, her sister Clara called for the first time in months. Her voice was strained, stripped of its usual composure, and she spoke quickly as though afraid Amelia might hang up. She filled in the details the hospital hadn't, explaining how quickly their parents' health had declined, how fear had replaced certainty in the house Amelia once called home. Clara spoke of sleepless nights, of doctor's appointments, of regret that hovered just beneath the surface without ever fully forming into an apology. She reminded Amelia that family was family, that no matter what had happened, blood still mattered when lives were at stake. Amelia listened quietly, absorbing every word, while memories surged uninvited. She remembered being told to leave, the envelope on her desk, the way her parents had reframed rejection as a lesson. Now, the language had shifted. Where once there had been lectures about independence, there were now careful requests and unspoken expectations. Clara did not directly ask her to help, but the weight of the request pressed down all the same. When the call ended, Amelia felt hollow, suspended between two realities that no longer fit together. Ethan found her sitting in silence later that night, staring at her phone as if it might ring again. She told him everything in fragments, struggling to keep her voice steady as she explained the diagnosis, the hospital's request, the sudden reappearance of people she had learned to live without. Ethan listened without interrupting, his presence grounding as always, but Amelia could see concern flicker in his eyes, not for her parents, but for her. He reminded her gently that whatever she decided, it had to be her choice, not one made from guilt or fear, and his words settled into her like a quiet anchor. As the days passed, messages from the hospital and her sister began to accumulate. Each notification tightened the knot in her chest, each update a reminder that time was no longer on anyone's side. Amelia found herself replaying old conversations, searching for signs that love had ever been unconditional, that this request came from something other than necessity. She wondered what it meant to be asked to give a part of her body to people who had once decided her presence was optional, and whether survival, theirs or hers, could ever be separated from the past that bound them together in ways she had never chosen. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It seeped into Amelia's life gradually, disguising itself as concern, responsibility, and reason. Another call from the hospital, another message from Clara, another carefully worded reminder that time was critical and options were limited. No one outright demanded her organs, yet every conversation carried the same unspoken conclusion, that as a daughter, as family, she was the most logical solution. Amelia began to feel as though her body was no longer entirely her own, as if it had already been partially claimed by a decision she had not yet made. Doctors explained the process with clinical calm, outlining the tests, the surgery, the risks, and the recovery with practiced precision. They spoke of percentages and probabilities, of how donors usually recovered well, of how giving part of a liver or a kidney was considered safe in healthy adults. Amelia nodded through these conversations, asking practical questions, while her mind raced ahead to the consequences they did not fully articulate. Time off work, physical vulnerability, long-term health uncertainties, each detail added weight to a choice that felt increasingly impossible. What unsettled her most was how quickly the conversation shifted from whether she would help to how soon she could. Clara's calls grew more emotional as the weeks passed. She spoke of their parents' fear, of their quiet moments of reflection, of how much it would mean to them if Amelia stepped forward. Occasionally, Clara's voice would break, and she would confess how overwhelmed she felt carrying the responsibility alone. She never mentioned the eviction directly, never acknowledged the fracture that had driven Amelia away. but she hinted at regret in abstract ways, as though naming the harm might somehow jeopardize their chances. Amelia felt herself pulled in two directions, toward empathy for her sister's burden and away from the familiar role of emotional caretaker she had spent her life trying to escape. At night, the guilt settled in most heavily. Amelia lay awake imagining the worst outcomes, haunted by questions that had no gentle answers. If she refused, would she be responsible for their deaths? If she agreed, would she finally be worthy of the love that had always felt conditional? She examined her motivations obsessively, searching for a decision that felt pure rather than coerced. The idea of sacrificing a part of her body stirred a deep, instinctive fear, one that clashed violently with the expectations placed upon her. Her parents had once decided she was expendable in their lives. Now, the irony was cruel and unmistakable.